Welcome to Conservative Solutions for Our Common Challenges. My name is Dan Alvis. I serve as the Member of Parliament for Okanagan Lake West, South Kelowna in the beautiful interior of British Columbia. And this podcast is all about the people who are quietly doing the work to make our communities and our country better off. They're the ones that are seeking to apply their experience towards practical solutions, not for the headlines, not for the spotlight, but for their communities. And today, we're very excited to have Gavin Dew, the MLA for Kelowna Mission. Gavin was first elected as a member of the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia in October of 2024. He's had a long career in the private sector, working on everything from infrastructure projects to tech businesses and startups, as well as striking out on his own as a local entrepreneur right here in Kelowna. Gavin, thank you so much for coming today, and I'm really looking forward to this.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Dad.
Great. So let's talk a little bit about you and your work as an MLA for Kelowna Mission. What's got you occupied? What's taken up your time?
Well, Dan, it's definitely a target-rich environment in the BC legislature these days. We have an NDP government that is seemingly in free fall. We've had a couple of polls in a row showing that they're now collapsing and that the BC Conservatives have stepped into a pretty significant lead provincially. So we're very happy with that. And I think the real reason that seems to have catalyzed that is the recent provincial budget, which was one of the worst budgets we've seen in this country in a long time, with more than a $13 billion deficit, a threefold increase in provincial debt, the imposition of $4 billion in new taxes, the expansion of provincial sales tax onto professional services, which will take in about another $500 million a year in tax, an increase in personal taxes, and a whole bunch of other measures that have been, as we described it, an assault on families and seniors and small business. So people have lost a lot of confidence in the NDP government.
So when I was door knocking in South Kelowna recently, as you're saying, seniors, small business owners, they couldn't believe how bad that budget was. It was panned, I think, pretty widely. And certainly, for someone who has worked as hard in both large and small business, for you to be coming into politics at this time, what do you think we need to see more of it in the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia, drawing from that business experience?
I think, Dan, what we need is more people that actually understand how an economy works. When you go into politics, especially when you come from the business community, you sort of tend to make the same jokes as everyone else, that the NDP couldn't run a lemonade stand and that they don't understand economics. And sometimes you're tempted to think that you're exaggerating. But then when you get into actually debating substantive legislation, you realize it's not an overstatement. It might be an understatement. There's not a lot of people on the government side of the house that have really any direct practical experience in business. I'm not hyper-partisan. I'm not inclined to believe that people start from, an unconstructive place. But even if they're trying to help business, even if they're trying to be a party of the economy, it's clearly very difficult for a government to do that when there are so few people there that actually have any practical experience in the private sector.
Well, it seems to me that they're having a real struggle with large capital projects, infrastructure projects. They're supposed to have broad public benefits, but if they, cost so much, or it takes years to deliver things like a hospital on the island, I hear the cost overruns are enormous. Can you give me an example from your own experience in the private sector of how to get these projects done?
Yeah, you bet, Dan. I worked on the Trans Mountain expansion project for several years as it was going through its approval stages. If you look at that project, which was a private sector project and then became a public sector project because, frankly, the risk on it was increased so dramatically that it had to be nationalized in order to be completed. The original Trans Mountain pipeline was completed in 1953. It took 18 months and it cost $93 million. That's about $1 billion in today's dollars. The twinning of that pipeline took a decade and cost $34 billion. Some of that was about building to higher environmental standards, costs escalate, things like that. But frankly, to get to $34 billion and be forced to nationalize a project that had a very strong commercial case is just absolutely absurd to me.
Yeah, well, we're looking at back in Ottawa, between Ottawa, I should say, and Montreal, though the full footprint is supposed to be from Quebec City to Toronto. The Alto project, they're estimating it's going to be $90 billion to service an already, well-served, area. And these are the things. And then when I talk to people, they are just saying, well, why does everything cost so much? And I think a lot of it has to do with just basic management.
Well, I think, Dan, you look at, for example, in the budget, one of the most shocking things they did is, in their language, repaste a bunch of capital projects, including 6 long-term care centers at a time when we're going to need 16,000 more spaces in long-term care. So they took these long-term care facilities, including Cottonwoods right here in Kelowna, and they basically just shoved them off into limbo. And their reason for doing so was that they had gotten to the point where the cost per bed was on the order of $1.5 million. If you talk to people in the private sector that run long-term care facilities, they tell us they can build a bed for about a third of that cost. Yeah. So effectively, government created standards under which these became insurmountably expensive and then used that as a reason to cancel them. You want to talk about on time, on budget. I was absolutely flabbergasted when I was looking through the Ministry of Infrastructure Service Plan, and on page 9, there's a section that is supposed to lay out the target for delivering public projects on time and on budget. There's supposed to be a target for what percent will be completed on time and on budget. And guess what? The timeline is to be determined. They couldn't even deliver a timeline, a target on time to get it into the budget. That's how completely lost at sea this government is when it comes to delivering projects.
So you and I share a lot of the similar geography because you represent Kelowna Mission and I represent South Kelowna, so there's a lot of overlap. So we see each other a lot of the different events. And I got to say, you're doing exactly what it takes, meeting people, showing up at all the different events. And I know that's really appreciated. For example, the OCCA events, the Okanagan Chinese Communities Association, they love the fact that you're showing up and whatnot. Now, do you really enjoy those types of events? What keeps you animated as a member of the Legislative Assembly?
Yeah, I love getting out there to community events, Dan. I mean, it's so great to be able to have the opportunity to engage with a lot of your constituents. Obviously, I book every single meeting that I possibly can when people reach out to the office. But when you go to events like that, you get the opportunity to talk to people that might not schedule a meeting with you or that are just looking for a 5-minute conversation. You learn so much, you hear so much from the community, and you get to be exposed to the breadth of the community. The OCCA, which again is originally the Chinese community, that's dear to my heart because I'm married into a Hong Kong Chinese family. So I absolutely love the fact that I get to take my kids to these events. My kids absolutely love it because they often get called on to, be part of the festivities, and it's just such wonderful memory making for them. But I also really love the work that the OCCA has done to kind of underpin the bringing together of different cultural communities here in Kelowna that are in some cases, not that big. So they've been a really good platform for bringing together the Filipino community, the Japanese community, the African community, all of these, the Indo-Canadian community, all these different groups that are so excited to share their culture and their heritage. I really believe that we get to know each other so much better when we break bread together and we share each other's culture and heritage. So I love going to events like that, and I find they really energize you. When you're off in Victoria or Ottawa, in your case, you're kind of locked inside a bubble where you're talking about things that most normal Canadians really aren't spending a lot of time on. So when you get to go to the riding, be in community, and talk to people, I think it really renews your perspective on what's important to everyday Canadians and what they're thinking about and talking about. So I absolutely love those events.
So we both have had different town halls related to crime and public safety. Recently we had Arpan Canna and Larry Brock and Frank Caputo come to do a town hall. And I know that we did a walkthrough with the Upper Rutland Business Association with Justin, the president of the organization. And it really did show that, Kelowna, the wider community, whether we're talking downtown or Rutland, has had so many issues We also met with the officer in charge of the RCMP, and But I remember speaking to Justin, and he says that you've really shown up for that community to try and support them. So maybe you can talk a little bit about some of your efforts there and what you're going to be doing in addition, because I think you're going to be holding a town hall soon.
Yeah, you bet. Rutland's a really important part of my riding. I represent the south half of Rutland, but I do my best to be there for all of Rutland. It's a really important community, but it's also one that's facing a disproportionate amount of challenges. There are a significant number of low barrier wet shelters there. There's a social development office there, and those have compounded some of the challenges in terms of street disorder, public safety, the mental health and addiction challenges that we're facing, frankly, everywhere in the province and everywhere in the country. I talk often to folks both from the business community, like Justin at the Uptown Rutland Business Association, as well as folks like the Rutland Residents Association, and people are really frustrated there. I was just visiting with a constituent in Rutland last week, and when I went to visit her, there was a 10-inch knife stuck in the fence outside of her front door because earlier that morning she'd asked someone who was using drugs to leave her front lawn at 5 a.m., and they had evidently come back and stuck a knife in her fence. And that unfortunately was neither the first or the worst death threat that she's faced. She's actually administered Narcan 50 times. Just as an everyday citizen, civilian, living there, being forced to deal with those kinds of issues.
50 times?
50 times.
She's had to administer that.
Yeah, she's had syringes, including bent needles, put in her mailbox. She's had people light fires and defecate in the rock features in her front yard. She goes for walks carrying a Narcan kit, gloves, and a sharps box because she's constantly having to clean up throughout the area. So people are just really frustrated with the kind of public disorder and lack of safety they're experiencing. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that absolutely, look, the city is doing all that it can, and its budget is being stretched in that regard. The RCMP, particularly under the leadership of Chris Gables, who's the new officer in charge, they're doing good work in that regard. Bylaws is doing all they can. But as Chris from the RCP has put it, you can't police your way out of bad policy. The challenge we have is that upstream from those frontline folks, upstream from the city, it is provincial and federal politics that have contributed to the public safety crisis that we're facing on our streets, in our neighborhoods, and in our small business districts.
Well, I know certainly the ARPAN Canada's Jail Not Bail Act, which would see some of these serious offenders being held back, because that's the problem we see as a liberal catch and release system. But what are some of the provincial avenues you think that you need to look at?
Yeah, Dan, that's a really good point. ARPAN's bill is definitely very strong. When you look at charge rates in Kelowna, they've gone down by 42% in the last number of years, which is among the most significant decreases in charge rates in the province. So that's a really big challenge, and that is a function in large measure of changes to federal law and policy. Provincially, there are, I'd say, two primary areas that we need to address. The first is that we have a significant shortage of Crown prosecutors. Kelowna needs probably 7 or 10 additional Crown prosecutors in order to manage the load that we're experiencing here in the region and to make sure people are actually being charged. If they need to go to jail, they need to go to jail. The other really obvious opportunity that is staring us in the face is that we need a facility for mandatory compassionate care. The Oliver Penitentiary is at around 25% utilization right now, in part because those charge rates have collapsed. So there's an opportunity there where, firstly, frankly, we should actually be charging people and they should actually go to jail if they need to go to jail. But equally, we have this facility that was completed with public funds, and it is sitting there not even half used. There is an opportunity to adapt that facility, and there's a consensus in the region from mayors about adapting that facility to provide a mandatory compassionate care alternative where people, frankly, have lost control of their lives and they need to be in care. Because we do need a full spectrum approach to this. There are people who are prolific property offenders who need to be arrested and need to go to jail. There are people who are hopelessly addicted and who are not capable of taking care of themselves, who need mandatory care. And tragically, there's a large cohort of people, in part because of the cycle of non-fatal overdoses and naloxone recoveries and the oxygen deprivation to the brain that happens during that, there are people that have very significant acquired brain injuries from which they will never recover. And we as a society are going to have to acknowledge the reality of what we have done, and we are going to have to make sure that we provide care for those individuals.
Well, I'm really happy you're so engaged and working with all these different associations, because it does take an approach, like you said, local, working with provincial and federal. And of course, I'm very grateful for the work that you yourself, Christina, Lowen, and Macklin McCall have done, just to try and work together on these issues because they're intertwined. Now, speaking though about a little bit more about the Okanagan, particularly when it comes to employment, we had some terrible employment numbers. We've seen the unemployment rate nationally tick up by 0.2%. Economists were expecting a modest increase of jobs around 10,000, but it seems like there's about 80 or 90,000 jobs lost. Maybe you could break down the provincial numbers, because I know you're watching those like a hawk.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. So provincially here in BC, we saw an overall net loss of 20,000 jobs in February. And what's particularly frustrating is that about more than 30,000 of those jobs were private sector jobs, were full-time jobs. So we saw full-time jobs decreasing, part-time jobs taking the place of some of those full-time jobs, a net loss of 20,000 jobs, and 3,000 people leaving the province, including 2,000 people who were in that youth category, that under 24 category. So what that really means is that we are losing people who can't get opportunities here. Our unemployment rate hasn't changed dramatically, but in part it's not changing because we're losing jobs and we're losing people. Holding the unemployment rate relatively steady because you're losing both jobs and people is not a success story. That's the real challenge. Yeah, so we've seen, again, also excess growth. There's been about, over the last number of years, there's been about 10 times the rate of public sector job creation versus private sector job creation here in BC, which is very, very troubling. The economists tell us that we should be creating about 5 private sector jobs for every 1 public sector job. And what's happened here in BC is the reverse. 5 public sector jobs created for every 1 private sector job. If you look at some of the charts on this stuff, Dan, it tells you exactly why we're in such a terrifically imbalanced fiscal position, because public sector has expanded dramatically, more than 40%, while private sector job growth has been quite anemic over the last number of years.
And I think, for being that we both represent fair chunks of Kelowna, Kelowna's had its own issues. The Statistics Canada said in December that the Kelowna metropolitan area, census metropolitan area, actually was the number one, was the highest unemployment in the country. Now that's changed a bit because obviously Ontario and manufacturing, particularly the car industry, has changed. But the numbers that we're talking about for February, you actually said exactly that, a lack of opportunity. People are actually they're choosing not to be looking for work, a large contingent. So, this is really quite worrisome for me. And I know from speaking, to some of the different people involved, that a lot of it in December, a lot of that major drop was in construction. And so I've been speaking with the Central Okanagan Canadian Home Builders Association, both Cassie DeVere is the executive director, as well as Krista Payne, the president. And they're quite concerned too, because obviously these economic winds are blowing the wrong way. And so one of the things we talked about is, how do we get more construction in Kelowna? Now, in addition to seeing changes to get permits issued faster, one of the fastest things that the federal government could do is to actually eliminate the GST for homes under 1.3 million. That would instantly push the industry to supply more homes and get people working. And of course, the knock-on effect is huge. Now, is there something similar you think that you have provincially that you're looking at? Because we somehow need to focus on building up the Okanagan.
Yeah, Dan, firstly, you're right to point out the impact of construction on those jobs numbers. A significant part of that really high unemployment was, in fact, in the construction sector. And now, anecdotally, we're seeing a lot of people leave to get opportunities elsewhere. I was actually literally in the airport yesterday talking to someone who was flying home to Kelowna from a construction project they're managing in Saskatoon. And 99% of the resumes they're getting for that project in Saskatoon are from BC. So it's not look west, my friend. It literally is people leaving British Columbia and going to Saskatoon for opportunities in the construction sector. A lot of, single trade contractors who in some cases have moved from Alberta or have expanded to, second operations in British Columbia or in Kelowna are now pulling back and retreating. So we're seeing a real loss of people, of jobs, and frankly of capacity. So when we get to the point where we're ready to start building again, we're going to be missing a lot of the people that we so desperately need in order to do that construction work. If you look at the data, housing starts have collapsed, building permit values are down, according to a new Stats Can report. And one of the things that is really, really going to impact that home building sector is that the provincial government just added PST on professional services. So that includes architects and engineers, but it also includes bookkeepers, accountants, all those other areas that are frankly spread across the entire economy. Talking to the home builders, their rough estimate was that imposition or expansion of PST onto professional services will add at least about $5,000 per door to a single family home and significantly more to multifamily housing.
So $5,000 more. So that's going in the wrong direction. We need to see the cost of construction to go down, and we also need to keep our trades here. Someone told me one time that it's the dream of every tradesperson when they're hammering in someone else's home is that someday, if they can visualize that they can do the same for themselves, build their own home, then that's where they're going to go. And to hear that they're going places like Alberta or Saskatchewan, I think we're moving in the wrong direction.
I'd agree, Dan. And the hard part about this PST change is, frankly, we're kicking small business when they're down. BC has had consistently among the lowest small business confidence in Canada over the last year and a half, 2 years. It's really worrisome. The most galling, adding insult to injury aspect of this PST change is that PST is now being levied on security services. So if you're a small business in downtown Kelowna, you already are paying the cost of vandalism. You're paying the cost of shoplifting directly in your business. Your BIA, Downtown Kelowna Association, those levies are going increasingly toward paying for security. You are hiring private security in order to reduce shrinkage, theft, vandalism in your own business. Mm-hmm. And now that private security, that cost is going to go up by 7%. It's like taxing fire extinguishers in the middle of a fire. It's absolutely absurd because, again, this public safety crisis has been exacerbated by David Eby's irresponsible, reckless drug decriminalization experiment, which has just unleashed chaos on our downtown cores. So now you're literally paying yet another 7% on top of all the other costs of that crisis of public disorder. It's just absolutely insulting to small business.
Before we start moving to the greater economy, let's just maybe put a cork in talking about the Okanagan and the things we want to see to grow the economy. I recently tabled Bill C-262. It's an act to amend the Canada Post Act to essentially allow a national program where a vintner, an artisan distiller, a craft brewery would be able to send their products right across the country with national application, whether through Canada Post or another trusted carrier. Gavin, this is something I know that you care about as well, because breaking down trade barriers benefits us all. What do you think of the bill? What do you think this will do? Because your job is to help grow BC's economy. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, absolutely, Dan. Look, our wine industry is a really important bedrock industry for BC and for the Okanagan in particular. And I have to say, you've been a consistent champion for the sector for years. And I really, really appreciate all the work that you do. I know folks here locally appreciate that. When we think about trade barriers, it's such a ridiculous issue. The Importation of Intoxicating Liquors Act, under which we're sort of living under the shadow of that legislation, it was imposed in 1928, which was the same year the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that women were not people for the purposes of serving in the Senate. So although there's been some incremental changes made, we're still really living in the shadow of very archaic rules around the free movement of goods across Canada, in particular of wine. So I commend you for all the work that you've done to try to help get market access for all of our local producers here. And I think it's really going to pay off. Well,
one thing I do know is at the end of this month, there's going to be a committee on internal trade with all the provinces in Ottawa. And Minister LeBlanc has made it known publicly that he's going to be taking this idea to the provinces. I know in 2012, when I first proposed Bill C-311, which kind of opened up the importation for intoxicating liquors legislation originally for Canadian wine, it was so important to have the government of British Columbia behind that piece of legislation. Where do you think the EB government is at?
They haven't really been too vocal around that piece. I will give them credit for the fact that they did bring forward interprovincial trade barriers legislation recently. We were able to work constructively on that and to get that legislation passed. We pushed them for a little bit more accountability around how the powers created by that bill are used and the results, and they did unfortunately decline those amendments. But I will give them credit for being aligned around the importance of breaking down interprovincial trade barriers. I haven't heard a lot from them around wine, frankly, so I am going to be pushing them on that. I have to admit I'm a little frustrated by the approach they've taken. They made a big performative gesture early on in the new Trump administration of pulling red state liquors from BC liquor store shelves. And I pushed them hard to get local craft-produced liquor onto those shelves, which they frankly failed to do for a year. So I just want to make sure that rhetoric and symbolism are matched by action that actually unlocks opportunity for small businesses here in BC, including our fantastic spirits producers, our brewers, and of course our winemakers.
Well, and on the winemakers, BC wine brewers, they were the first ones to say this is exactly what our industry needs. And so I certainly appreciate their support, but I also appreciate your support as well. This is one of those things I think hopefully all British Columbians can get behind, that we want to see more BC wine and craft breweries, as well as those spirits right across this great country.
I'll lift a glass to that, Dan.
Now, one other thing is obviously the economy is changing, and one of the things that John Stackhouse, who's a well-known economist for RBC, he says that the one thing he's continually hearing is about the need for more data centers, because obviously AI and the systems that run it are going to help make our businesses more productive. And so, this is an area that I think, given your critic role, and again, it's the critic for jobs and the economy, correct?
Jobs, economic development, innovation, and artificial intelligence. So JEDI, they actually changed the name of the official ministry to Jobs and Economic Growth, but I insisted on keeping my critic title as JEDI so that I could be the last Jedi, or the blue Jedi. And as I like to joke, they can have my blue lightsaber when they pry it from my cold, dead hands.
Well, a lot of the things that Lucasfilm does is probably involve some AI and CGI. So, but one of the things that I've noticed is that the EB government has basically put the AI industry on notice that they don't have the power. I think they said that they'll cap it at 400 megawatts. And so the challenges for this is the demand for AI is not leaving. We have universities, you have businesses here in BC. They're just typing into that network, but instead of those electrons are actually coming from other jurisdictions. So places like Alberta, places like the United States, and often they use things like natural gas to burn them. So, the question I have for you is, first of all, have you done any investigation on this policy, and why are all these AI data centers going to other jurisdictions? To me, that doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's a huge missed opportunity for British Columbia, Dan. So they've brought in effectively policies that will cap the amount of electricity available to data centers, in part because we're running out of electricity here. We're actually buying about 20% of our electricity every year, much of which we buy from the United States, which they produce using our natural gas, which we sell to them for an 80% discount. So instead of using natural gas of our own here, we literally we sell it to the Americans for cheap. Then they sell us back power, and then we pretend that there are no emissions associated with that electricity. It's absolutely delusional.
And we don't get any of the jobs or any of the taxes because these AI data centers are quite profitable.
Yeah.
And so someone else is writing those checks to Alberta, or they're writing those checks to whatever state they're in, rather than British Columbia.
Yeah, and there's a huge opportunity there, frankly. We're naturally positioned where, for example, we could be using our very substantial natural gas supply here in British Columbia to power data centers. And we could then, frankly, have sovereign AI, sovereign processing capacity here in Canada. We could have greater proximity to those data centers. And in fact, there are proposals that have been talked about to locate natural gas-powered data centers in northwestern British Columbia and then export compute to Asia where there's massive demand. So we could actually be exporting compute just like we export liquefied natural gas. The opportunity is massive, but this government doesn't appear interested, and especially doesn't appear interested if it involves using our natural gas to help power those data centers.
Well, to me, it seems that we're a major supplier for natural gas. It's an industry that supports our jobs here, that writes huge amounts of between taxes from the jobs to the royalties to the Treasury. We have a $13.3 billion deficit this year, despite adding an extra $4 billion. So to me, it just seems to be odd that we would be literally encouraging these data centers to be located somewhere else. Now, you've also worked a lot with the tech sector, and I think everyone thinks the tech sector is a great area for BC to grow in. But to me, it almost seems that if you're inviting that where all the tools to play with tech are being pushed outside of the province, what are you hearing from the tech industry?
Yeah, Dan, that's a really good point. Like the signal that it sends when you are so disinterested in actually building sovereign compute power here in BC, the signal that sends to the tech sectors is not a good one. So I'm not really hearing a lot of people that are very impressed by what the province is doing on tech and on AI. It seems like we've sort of rendered ourselves rather irrelevant in that regard. Our fundamentals are also a real challenge too, because a lot of the time what you see from government is this desire just to drive around dumping money out the back of a truck in the form of grants in order to try to get photo ops with young people with foosball tables in tech offices. The reality is that what actually creates opportunity in the tech sector is the freedom to innovate. It's about making sure we create fundamental conditions where people feel as though this is the right place to start a company. That comes down to cost of living. It comes down to taxes. It comes down to the fundamentals of actually wanting to set up a company here. And those fundamentals are going in the wrong direction. Go ahead, Dan.
Well, no. So if you want to start a tech startup, and your taxes are higher, you find that you don't have access to AI data centers, or if you do, that they're further away, and you can't get people to stay because the quality of life isn't as good, or they can't afford to buy a home. That seems to me where it's a lose proposition.
Absolutely, Dan. Accelerate Okanagan put out a study last year that looked at some of the fundamentals affecting our tech sector. And one of the challenges is that it's difficult to attract entry-level tech workers because our cost of living advantage has somewhat dissipated. So if you're trying to get entry-level folks working in a tech company where the pay is good but not great, it's harder and harder for folks to do that because the cost of living has gone up. At the same time, it's also harder and harder to retain senior people in the tech sector because the tax rate is so high. So I've got a lot of friends that work in the tech sector, and over again, I see people that are moving to Canmore. They're moving to Austin, Texas. They built companies and built success here in British Columbia, but their next company is going to be based out of San Francisco instead. So when you talk about, AI is producing the opportunity to build a really serious and successful company with a comparatively smaller number of employees, because generative AI can be used to produce an incredible amount of output very efficiently. So already there are less jobs available in some ways, but also those jobs are being created elsewhere, and that capital is being kept elsewhere. So there are entrepreneurs who have built success in BC, who own homes in BC, who love British Columbia, who'd like to be able to have their capital here. But if they're left with a choice, they're going to end up keeping it somewhere else. So that's the real challenge, is how do we make sure that we change the direction of that, and that we signal to people that British Columbia is a place where they can be successful, they can domicile their companies, they can domicile their capital, the tax rates are reasonable, that opportunity is there. Because we do have a highly skilled workforce, we have excellent post-secondary institutions here, we've got so many great fundamentals, and yet the signals that we're sending to the market are just absolutely all wrong.
Yeah, well, again, these are things that we need to have better policy, both at the federal level, but also the provincial level. So let's just finish up with a couple lightning round questions here, Gavin. So first of all, for you, what is one myth about the private sector that you want people in government, this government, to bust?
Yeah, I think that this government doesn't understand that you actually can't tax business you tax the end users of what business sells. And that's what we're seeing with a lot of these different tax policies. There's just a tendency to believe, hey, we're just going to tax business. But the reality is when you put higher taxes on the inputs that go into building homes, homes are going to get more expensive. When you put higher taxes and impose more costs on storefront small business, prices are going to have to go up in order to pay for that. So just understanding the basic economics of how taxation on business works is something that I think every government needs to understand better.
Great. Okay. Well, next question for you for in terms of the crime. If you could take one policy provincially that would have a biggest impact on the public safety of your citizens, what would that be? Mandatory
care. We need to get people that are struggling on the street, who are lost, who don't know where they are, who have lost control of their lives, and we need to get them into mandatory compassionate care and help them to get off of drugs and try to rebuild their lives.
Good. Now, last question here. If you could have one vacation anywhere in the world, where would you go?
Kelowna.
See, folks, you've elected a local yokel, and he cares deeply about the community. Gavin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you come today. It's very few individuals I know that can wax eloquently about both the construction, the tech sector, infrastructure, AI centers, and you've done always that. And I look forward to seeing you at the next OCCA event or another community event.
Hey, thanks so much, Dan. Look, I want to thank you, Dan, because when I first started on my journey in politics here, you were there for me. You gave me great advice, and I stole a lot of your volunteers and your team to help on my campaign. We have a really healthy overlap between, the Conservative Party of Canada and the Conservative Party of British Columbia, of really, really good people that are motivated to see good governments at both levels. So I appreciate you very much, and I appreciate all the people around you.
Well, thank you, Gavin. It's a pleasure. These partnerships, when we talk, folks, about the need to have local, federal, and provincial representatives working together, Gavin, you're a great example of someone who wants to build this province, build this country up. So, folks, there you have it. Gavin Dew, the MLA for Kelowna Mission. Folks, if you enjoyed today's conversation, please do like and share it with someone else. We try to interview the people that are out there working hard for you, trying to build up our community and our country. And I'm quite proud of these conversations. So the people we interview here at Conservative Solutions inspire me, and I hope this conversation today inspired you as well. Thank you again, Gavin.
Thanks, man.